Hey there, Painful Mess here. Um, Unfortunately, I typed this whole video up a while ago, but now, as of a few days ago, there's a new YouTube video up by Richard Carrier, which is excellent, by the way, on this exact topic, and it does, an infinitely better job than I could ever do. So, I hadn't seen the video at the time of writing this, and I didn't really update it or anything based on that. So, go check that out. I'll post a link to it. Um, so last time I made the seemingly absurd claim that essentially every New Testament scholar, including Christian ones, think that most of the gospel stories are myth. If you grew up a Christian, or even if you are now an atheist and you haven't read the evidence for this, then you might find this claim unbelievable, or at least you might think I'm exaggerating the evidence and support for it. So I'll tell you a little more about this. First, what am I not saying? Well, I'm not saying that Jesus is a myth. And I'm not saying that every single thing in the Gospels are myth. Most scholars believe there was a historical person named Jesus, but he was mythologized in the Gospels, and you need to use other methods to figure out what the historical Jesus was all about. The argument I'll give here is merely saying that most of the Gospels are not intended by the authors to be historical, and instead they freely made things up in a literary way that explains what their theology was. So they're using, standard literary techniques to explain their theology. I'm going to present an example of 6 different types of evidence that the writers were writing fiction. Note, these are meant to just give you a tiny flavor of each type of evidence. There are literally hundreds of examples of each, and there have been entire books devoted to any given type. This is not meant as some full rigorous argument, so don't discard an entire body of evidence just because you don't find one of my chosen examples convincing. And I'm not saying these are the most convincing of examples. These are sort of ones that I can present quickly in a YouTube video. Uh, what I find to be the most convincing arguments take a very long time to explain in their thoroughness, going to the Greek text, looking word for word parallels, huge whole long arguments about this that are given in books. So those don't suit well to a YouTube video. So, okay, supposing there's all this evidence, then what is the total argument that the Gospels are myth? Well, if there were only it's sort of a Bayesian argument. If there were only one or two examples of each of these types of things that I'm going to present, then there would be this small chance that the authors were writing history, and it just randomly happens that it looks like they're writing fiction. But the fact is, the actual amount of evidence is mind-bogglingly gigantic, so it becomes essentially impossible to explain these coincidences, but using the idea that the essence of the Gospels are historical. On the other hand, the hypothesis that the authors were writing fiction explains perfectly the sheer mind-numbing amount of examples of writing that looks like myth. It is exactly what we'd expect to find if they were writing myth. The hypothesis that they were writing history just cannot explain the data. So, okay, what exactly is all this evidence that I'm talking about? Well, type 1, my first type. We know the authors just filled in events from prophecies of the Old Testament. Now, no one writing what they thought was true history would actually do this. How do we know that they were doing this? Well, there's several great examples of this. That are just caused by translation error. So the writers write something that's not historical or maybe even a physical impossibility, but it comes directly from a translation error. A great example is Matthew mistranslating that Jesus must have ridden 2 donkeys into Jerusalem. This isn't what the prophecy says, but we can look at this and see what he thought it said. We can see how he misunderstood what it said. And so if he just copied this, we understand where the absurdity comes from. If he wrote a story he thought was true based on some other source, it would be an unimaginable coincidence that the supposedly historical event doesn't fulfill the prophecy at all, but instead fulfills a mistranslation of the prophecy. So clearly Matthew just copied this. Other examples are Jesus coming from Nazareth, which is a misunderstanding of the prophecy, he shall be called a Nazarene. We know that this is not historical because no one could be from Nazareth at that time. The archaeological record shows that no one lived in that region at the time. So this is just copying what the prophecy, he thinks the prophecy should say, getting it wrong, and then now we know that that's what happened by looking at it after the fact. Type of evidence number 2. Well, the Bible, or the New Testament, and the Gospels in particular, are just full of symbolic names and places. Now, of course, this one could be explained by coincidence also if there were just a few of these, because sometimes people's names do have symbolic meaning in real life if it were a story, But it turns out that these examples just are seemingly endless. There's no way these happen by chance. We have Jesus being crucified at Passover, so Jesus is symbolically sacrificed for the Passover atonement ritual. The world going dark for 3 hours at his death is clearly symbolic. I mean, that's definitely not a historical event. The curtain in the temple ripping to symbolize the tearing of the wall between heaven and earth. I mean, Barabbas, who was set free instead of Jesus, has a name that translates to Son of the Father. That was just, a paragraph of the Bible right there that I named 4 symbolic things. And on and on and on that goes. Type of evidence number 3 is we have ahistorical events that can be explained through literary importance. So building off of this last symbol, the Barabbas symbol, the idea of letting a convicted criminal free just because the crowd chooses him is not something the Romans would allow. It's definitely not a historical event. But why is it in there then? It's not because they thought it was historical. It's easily explainable as paralleling a Jewish tradition of having 2 goats for sacrifice, but one is set free, and this is called a scapegoat. That's where the terminology comes from. And the other is sacrificed to atone. Now, recall Barabbas' name means son of the Father. Here we have 2 sons of the Father, one of which is set free, and the other is sacrificed to atone. It is a direct, amazingly simple parallel, and it explains the ahistoricity of that event. Another example is that Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. This is a bit anachronistic because the disciples don't know that Jesus will be crucified on a cross, but the detail works as a piece of literary irony here. Simon Peter ends up denying Christ and not himself, but then in another sudden twist of events, a different Simon, Simon of Cyrene, is the one who carries Jesus' cross. So that's explaining things that didn't actually happen, but they're explainable because of their literary importance. Type of evidence number 4 is the authors just changed events to suit their needs. So using this previous example, the 3 synoptic gospels all have Simon of Cyrene carry Jesus' cross. It turns out that some early Gnostics claimed that he was the one crucified and not Jesus. So it would be convenient for an apologetic purpose if a story surfaced in which Jesus carries his own cross so that it was clearer that Jesus was the one crucified. And guess what? This is exactly what we see. John looks at the old Gospels and he just changes this part of the story to suit his needs. And this happens in several places. We see Matthew looking at Mark's story of the resurrection, and at that time, Matthew knew that there were the early Christians were being accused of just grave robbing, and so Matthew needed something to help him defend the apologetic of the faith. So what does he need? He needs guards at the tomb so that people know that it was not just grave robbed. And this is exactly what happens. Matthew looks at Mark, he needs the story to be changed, so he changes the story. We have unapologetic changing of stories here. The authors did this all over the place, and we know they did it, and we know why they did it. Type of evidence number 5. The overall narrative structure and the individual stories all have very clear parallels to other myths. Now this is like the really, really big topic that has the most convincing examples, I think. But also these take books to build the case in a convincing way. So, for example, the writers were all highly educated Greek writers, so they were well versed in Homer. It turns out that whole books have been devoted to writing, have been written pointing out how Mark parallels Homer. Individual stories also have parallels to the Old Testament, and in particular the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. Individual so Just for example, the resurrection narrative in Mark parallels the story of Daniel in the lion's den. This was so obvious to Matthew that when he added to the story, he only added in ways that maintained the compatibility with the parallel with Daniel in the lion's den. Another example of the same paralleling to the Old Testament is that Jesus performs two sequences of 5 miracles, each just as Moses did. The first has to do with water, where he walks on water, and the first of Moses' miracles is to part the Red Sea. They both have to do with water, and you can go, one by one all the way through this and see that they perfectly parallel each other. Jesus' miracles are just paralleling Moses' miracles. And I'm tempted to do an entire video just talking about the resurrection narrative in John and how it parallels First and Second Kings, which is presented in Randel Helms' Gospel Fictions. Great book. You should read it if you're interested in this type of thing. All right. The sixth type of evidence is the example of reification. So this is a tool used in myth where you take a fictional character and you turn them into a real person in your story. So this happens with Lazarus, who was originally a fictional character in a parable in Luke, but then John takes that character and makes him into a real person who dies and gets resurrected by Jesus. And the reason for doing this has theological significance. The parable of Lazarus is to teach that people will not be persuaded by raising someone from the dead. And then, in a bit of irony, John reverses the theme of the parable and makes Lazarus a real person to show that in real life, if Lazarus is raised from the dead, he will persuade people. Because people are persuaded that by this miracle. So, like I said, you could argue and nitpick over any one of these or, any other that you look up, but the point isn't whether any individual example makes a convincing case. The argument is that taken as a whole, the sheer number of places these fictional devices occur forces us to conclude that the authors were not writing history. I mean, even conservative Christian New Testament scholars who are honest about this stuff are just totally convinced by this case. The argument is over, the debate is over. Everyone basically agrees that the Gospels are mostly myth. So I'll add quickly that if you are a Christian, then learning to think this way will make you a much better Christian and not a worse one. Don't think that thinking of the Gospels as fiction is bad theology or bad, something a Christian wouldn't do. Almost all of the theological points these early Christian writers are trying to make to you will be lost if you try to take these as historical texts. If you truly believe the Gospels are important documents, then you should be overjoyed to take them as fiction, because it is only in doing so that all of these underlying messages that the authors are trying to tell you can actually be uncovered. Alright, so this went on a long time, but I didn't even present half of the examples I wanted to, so that's some food for thought for now.